You're listening to Quorum Radio.
Hey folks, Bill from Quorum Radio. Please do me a big favor and give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, comment, and share. Much obliged. Thanks so much for watching Quorum Radio on Best Book Network. Quorum Radio now on with John McManus, President Emeritus of the John Birch Society, U.S. Marine, graduate of Holy Cross College, and a man who's done a lot to serve his country. Wanted to get John McManus on the program because a lot of people have a lot of questions, and there's lots of misunderstandings about the John Birch Society. And I wanted to give John the opportunity to clear it up and state the record. And as I stated to him initially, he's a young 80, well, how old are you now, John, can I ask?
86.
He's a young 86. He wants to talk about current events, which I think is fantastic. He's not living in the past. Some people think the John Birch Society is just basically is attached to an old vision of America, but they're very much focused on today, and they love the United States, and they want America to be the shining city on the hill that it was meant to be. And so they're loyal patriots, and they're quite aware of what's going on in our country in 2021. But I did want to go back a few years, just as a brief part of our encounter here, and talk about the John Birch Society in the early 60s of the United States, at a time when, we were at the height of the Cold War or deep into it. And of course, we know that in 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came pretty close to nuclear war. And I wanted to ask John if at that time, were you in the John Birch Society in the early 60s?
I started off my relationship with the Birch Society by feeling that it was a kooky organization that I wanted nothing to do with, and I got a little bit frightened about it. So I went to a meeting. And at the meeting, I found out that these people weren't kooky and they were good Americans. And I ended up buying some books, and I went home and started reading the books that I had bought, and got more and more concerned about the country. So a lot of things happened in the meantime, and I joined the society myself in 1964. I joined the staff of the society in 1966 as one of the field representatives. In 1968, they brought me into the home office for my I guess writing capability and speaking capability, and I served in that for quite a while. In 1973, I became the public relations director and the official spokesman for the society. In 1995, I was named president of the society. I served in that until the year 2010. And then when I hit 80 years old, no, it was 2015. When I hit 80 years old, that there's a requirement that you step aside, and I did. So I became president emeritus. But I'm still doing some writing, some speaking, radio and television interviews, Zoom meetings, and so forth.
Wow.
In other words, I've been involved with every aspect of the John Birch Society.
Sure. When did you have that transition moment? I mean, were you in the Marine Corps at the time? I graduated college in 1957?
I graduated in 57. I went 3 years in the Marine Corps, so I got out in the summer of 1960. I had a job as an electronics engineer.
Really?
With a degree in physics. And there was a fellow working at the same place that I was, who one day said to me, "You ought to know better," about something I had said that had a political connotation to it. So I said, well, "What do you mean I ought to know better?" He said, "Obviously you're not reading the right stuff." I said, "Well, what's the right stuff?" So he steered me to a conservative publication. I subscribed, and I began to see how wrong I had been about some things. And then I started investigating the Birch Society, expecting to find that it was something I wanted to stay away from. But sure. I found just the opposite.
And what year was this approximately, John? Was this like 1959?
61, 62. I didn't have any connections with the Birch Society while I was in the Marine Corps. But when I got back, my wife and I, we settled in Eastern Massachusetts, which is where she's from. Most guys end up where the wife is from, and I'm a good example.
Yeah.
I think you
Hey,
might.
listen, let me ask you a question before I respond to that, what you just said. So where were you stationed in the Marine Corps when you were an officer, right?
Yes, I was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. I did a 6 months tour of duty on a troop ship with a battalion of Marines. We were called upon to land in Lebanon in 1958 because the pro-Western Christian anti-communist leader of Lebanon was besieged by communist uprising within his country. And so we were sent in there to just say, don't do that. Well, what happened is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a pro-world government, anti-American organization that spawns a lot of government officials, they sent a guy over from Marquette University, another Jesuit college, and he took care of everything. And so what happened is that the pro-Western Christian anti-communist leader was out and the chief communist rabble-rouser was in. He had taken over the government with the aid of the diplomat from the United States. So,
amazing.
Yeah, well, that kind of thing didn't happen just in Lebanon. It happened in a lot of other places. But then we came out of Lebanon and we got back on the ships, went to Italy for a little R&R, and I visited Rome and went up. We pulled into Naples. I went up to Rome and I found that Pope Pius XII had just died. Everything was closed. I wasn't able to get to see what I would like to have seen. But back on the ship, and then eventually Marine Corps transferred me back to Quantico, and I had a job there in the Marine Corps training apparatus.
It's funny you mentioned. So you generally the guy goes where the wife lives or is from. A lot of guys at Holy Cross were from the Worcester area or from Boston or somewhere in Massachusetts. I think almost predominantly, but you had people from New York and other places, right?
That's
Rhode
right.
Island.
Well, I had 6 or 8 classmates from the Jesuit high school I went to, attended in Brooklyn, New York. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, by the way.
Your classmate,
6
one
or
of
8
your
of my
classmates also was in, what's that?
6 or 8 of my classmates from the prep school I went to also went to Holy Cross, Brooklyn Prep. Had a lot of influence by Jesuits in our careers.
Jesuits and women. That's what happens, yeah.
My only uncle was a Jesuit priest.
Well, great. I assume he's gone to the great beyond. May he rest in peace.
Well,
I have a very good memory of a couple of Jesuits at Holy Cross.
Yeah.
And a couple of very good men. And I remember, this is back in the late 70s, saying Hail Mary. That was probably one of the only classes where that happened with Father Joe Shea. But I appreciated that. I thought it was a great, and it was a habit, very exemplary, and it left a mark. A lot of good things. I have to say, although it had changed a lot from your time.
It has changed tremendously. And I stopped sending contributions to the school maybe 30, 40 years ago. While we're discussing that situation, I want to point out that when I became emeritus in John Birch Society and no longer had a lot of responsibilities that I had served for years, I took the time out to write a book. And I'll hold it up here. It's called The Deep Church Revealed, subtitle, An Enemy Within.
Wow.
And I go over 300 years of penetration of the Catholic faith by enemies, mostly Freemasons, and the destruction that they accomplished. It's quite a story.
No, it's an incredible story. And, I don't know what you think about Malachi Martin. Do you have an opinion?
I got very friendly with Malachi Martin.
Really?
He lived in Manhattan, and I used to go down to New York on Birch business, and I'd take some time out and go visit with him, share some of my views. And he said, he was always very complimentary. He says, you've dug into some things here that nobody else seems to have done. And I salute you. And we got to be very friendly. And
oh, wow.
I
have
know
a very good memory of him. My mother used to write him letters.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think he answered. And he was just, you heard the Art Bell interviews, right, John?
Oh, yes. Art Bell. I know those interviews were on at midnight in the Eastern time zone, so I didn't hear too many of them.
Well, no, it's sure. It's for people who are going cross country or, I guess, are up and they can't sleep, insomniacs, and a bunch of other people. But he had incredible guests on in great interviews with Malachi Martin. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the stuff is totally dead on. We have people that are undermining the church, undermining Western civilization and our Catholic Christian heritage, and bringing about downfall, the downfall of our country. And to say it's sad, it's almost besides the point. What are we going to do about it? But I do want to dwell for just a little bit, if I can, John, on the John Birch Society in Texas. Just before I think you formally started with them. What can you tell us about the JBS in 1962 to 1963, based on what you've learned, based on what you knew? Because I guess you got to know, was it the founder, was it Reich, or what was his name?
Welch,
right.
Robert Welch.
I'm sure you probably got to know him very well, right?
I did, right. Here's a book I wrote, The History of the John Birch Society. I don't know whether you can see.
Oh, wow. Is that you?
That's me with Robert Welch.
Wow.
And we're having a bit of a laugh. What were you laughing about? We're laughing about, I had just come back from speaking at one of the left-wing institutions of learning, supposedly a college here in the Boston area.
Yeah.
And I told Robert Welch I wanted combat pay.
And this is like what, 1970?
That was probably around 1972, 3, 4, somewhere in there.
Oh man, that was a really combative time.
It was an interesting time. Yeah, it was when I was now the public relations director of the society, and he appointed me to that in early '73. So it was shortly after that. I wrote the book while I was still president of the society. The subtitle is History of the Birch Society Recounted by Someone Who Was There. Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess I was there, right?
You sure were, right? Yeah, wow. Great. And you have a picture of it?
The book, yeah. I'm looking to see when it came out. It came out in 2018.
Great. So let me ask you a question. Okay, General Edwin Walker. Tell me about him.
Well, he was a commander of our troops in Germany, and he had worked with a couple of savvy members of the Army Corps that was there, and he started training them in anti-communism and what America is all about the Constitution, about the Declaration of Independence, and so forth, and the communist threat to the United States. Well, he was scoring quite heavily. The troops were very pleased with this. They were mostly very interested in what he was having them understand. But so Washington got wind of what was going on, and they relieved him of his command. And
at that time, I think John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, was trying to, just get along with Nikita Khrushchev, and he thought that would be the best way.
Well, there was a lot of buddying up with the communists and leaders of our country and so forth, and Walker didn't like that. I didn't like it either.
So, did you get to meet him? Did you get to know him before he passed away?
Never met General Walker. No.
So, of course, in 1963, according to Lee Harvey Oswald's widow, that they found a letter that he had written in case he were killed or arrested. The letter was found on April 10th, 1963. The date of an attempted assassination against General Walker that nearly succeeded. He was hit by bullet fragments. Apparently, the bullet passed through his hair. Didn't hit him, but almost did. And apparently, he had leaned over to get a pencil or something like that. The bullet hit the window sash and a screen, and he was lucky he wasn't killed. He was very close. Let me ask you, what do you remember about those days? How did the JBS react to all that?
That happened before I was a member of the Birch Society. I did learn a lot about it after I became a member and after I became an official at the headquarters, which was in Belmont, Massachusetts, by the way, Robert Welch's home.
Sure.
But what I knew of General Walker, I heard a couple of presentations that he gave. They were on recordings or on tape, and he was what I would call a very intense individual. I don't think he was a very good speaker. He had good information, but he didn't organize it, and he didn't present it logically and so forth, which is what I like to do.
Sure.
And he became a member of the Birch Society, and he went on a couple of speech tours for us, spoke at some of the large banquets that the society had arranged and so forth. But that was pretty much all before I even joined the society. And then I joined the staff in 1966, gave up my career as an electronics engineer to do that.
Sure. So what was the mood of the country under John F. Kennedy before he was killed? I mean, he was kind of wasn't really forceful against communism, I think you could say. I consider it strange that he didn't go in with the 101st Airborne Marine Divisions, Special Forces into Cuba in 1961. I don't see what the big deal was. I mean, who cares what people think?
The deal was that the American State Department and the top officials in the government wanted Castro to take over Cuba. There were a couple of successive U.S. ambassadors to Cuba who, before Castro took control, and that was in 1960, reported to their superiors in Washington to watch out for this guy Castro because he's a communist and an enemy of the United States. There was an ambassador named Gardner. There was another one named Smith who came after him, and he discovered the exact same thing without being allowed to talk to his predecessor, that Castro was a communist. 6 months before Castro did take Cuba, Robert Welch had started a magazine called One Man's Opinion. And in that magazine, he said, anybody who believes anything other than the fact that Fidel Castro is a dedicated lifelong communist doesn't know what he's talking about. He is exactly that, a dedicated lifelong communist. And so Castro was helped into power. The United States refused to deliver the weapons that had been ordered by the Batista government. And I'm no fan of Batista, but he was at least not a communist insurgent, as was Castro. So Castro took control. 6 months after Castro took control of Cuba, the man who was his personal pilot, flying him here and there all over Cuba, Pedro Diaz-Lanz, defected to the United States and decided that he was going to tell the world about, he had discovered that the guy he was working for was a bloody communist killer, Fidel Castro. So Pedro Diaz-Lanz ended up joining the Birch Society, went on speaking tours all over the country, did a lot of good for us, but he's long passed on. But that's a good example of what was going on. If you were pro-communist during that period, you had the favor of the United States State Department. And you had the State Department informing presidents that this is what we're going to do, and this is the why we're doing it, and so forth. Lying to Kennedy, lying to Nixon, lying. I don't know how much Kennedy and Nixon knew about what Castro really was, but they were either used or they were participants in a sellout of a nation about 90 miles south of Florida.
I want to see what your reaction is to this, but supposedly the Kennedy family was very friendly with Senator Joseph McCarthy.
That's true. McCarthy used to go down to Hyannisport for weekend vacations. He dated one of the sisters, almost married her and didn't, but was later betrayed by the Kennedys.
Well, he was a man who some say, they just say, Joe McCarthy, that's just associated with intolerance, cruelty, blindness, extremism, paranoia. But what's the truth about? Tell us the truth about the government in the 50s and 60s in our country, and of course later on in the 70s.
Well, during the 50s, especially, the House Committee on Un-American Activities was turning up communists in government. The Senate Internal Security Subcommittee was doing the same. Those two organizations have both been abolished. They don't turn up communists or disloyal Americans anymore. They're just not in business. McCarthy has supposedly damaged and hurt the careers, the reputations of a lot of decent individuals. And the answer to all of the numbers of people that McCarthy abused and was wrong about their communist connections to some, add up to none, add up to zero. Joe McCarthy was absolutely correct in what he was doing. And he got very little support from fellow senators, fellow congressmen, and he eventually died of a broken heart.
He was just basically destroyed in the media and
the media, yeah. Well, the media then turned on the Birch Society. They needed somebody to go after, so they turned on the Birch Society.
And let me ask you, what was Senator Joe McCarthy's relationship with the John Birch Society? Was he a close friend, or?
He was a friend of the founder of the Birch Society, but he died before the society was formed.
Wow, amazing.
Robert Welsh is the man.
Yeah, so he was basically right. The American State Department and the U.S. government was chock full of communists, like-minded people, fellow travelers.
Right. One of the most famous of those communists was Alger Hiss.
Oh yeah, tell us about Alger Hiss. Well, he came to Holy Cross once. You know that? In 1976, I think.
Did he?
Yes, sir.
Alger Hiss was
77.
Was a State Department official. He started in the Agriculture Department and moved to the State Department. All the time being a communist, all the time doing whatever he could to help the communist movement within the United States and in Russia. Alger Hiss is a co-author of the United Nations Charter. And the man who delivered the charter that was put together, finalized at a meeting in San Francisco where 50 nations sent delegates. And he brought it to Washington for the Senate to ratify it, which the Senate did, and therefore put us into the United Nations, which was a terrible mistake. A lot of members of the Senate were good Americans who didn't realize what was going on. The propaganda at the time, and I can remember this as a 10-year-old, I can remember the attitude was, well, look, we had World War I, we had World War II, we don't want to have World War III. Let's give this new United Nations a chance. Let's give it a try and see what happens. That's how we got in the United Nations. My own father, who was a very determined anti-communist, he said that himself. I remember him saying that. And I didn't know any better, so I went along with it. But I later found out a lot more about the United Nations. And the John Birch Society had a program started in the 60s, get us out of the United Nations. And it still goes on today. We still tell people the truth about the United Nations.
What is it? Okay, what is it about the UN that's especially troublesome or problematic?
Well, the United States was formed with the Declaration of Independence. which has the thunderous assertion at the beginning of it, men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and to secure these rights, governments are formed. That's it. Everything's in proper order. God on top, individuals with their freedoms next, and a government to protect those freedoms, not to water them down, not to do anything worse. And then the Constitution of the United States came along, and the Constitution, I like to say, if the Constitution of the United States were fully enforced as it still exists,
Yeah.
the federal government of the United States would be 20% its size and 20% its cost.
Amazing.
Right. I personally tried to get that message through to Donald Trump when he was running for re-election, when he was running for the first time.
Yeah.
I got to know the fellow who was his personal pilot. I see him at church every Sunday.
Wow.
Sometimes during the week.
Does he still work with President Trump?
Well, no, he doesn't. I said, Mike, his name was Mike. I said, Mike, you enjoyed working for Trump? He said, oh, very much so. It was a lot of fun and a lot of interesting things going on, and a lot of people. We were ferrying around in our plane. I said, well, why did you leave? He said, well, I told Trump he needed a new plane, so he got a new pilot.
He kept the old plane and
he kept
wow.
the old plane. Well, he finally didn't have to use the old plane anymore when he became president. He was now able to use U.S. What do they call it? Air Force.
Air Force One.
Yeah.
Wow, incredible. All right, so then, so tell us about the John Birch Society and its struggles, and what it found out about the United States in the 1960s and 70s.
Well, what happened what happened with the Birch Society is it was gathering messages, it was gathering numbers. Robert Welch would go out and speak to an audience of 1,000 people, and several hundred would join the society that night. And a lot of people were concerned. So the John Birch Society became a threat to the left-wing establishment in our country, the pro-communists and so forth. And so it had to be targeted. Well, it was targeted. It was targeted when they were provided somehow. Nobody knows for sure how they ever got a copy of a long letter that Robert Welch had written and then added to. It became a 3-page treatise about the career of Dwight Eisenhower. And it's not very complimentary. But when that book finally was published, it led to a surge of membership in the Birch Society that was incredible.
What is it about Eisenhower that people didn't learn?
They still haven't learned about Eisenhower.
Sure.
He was pro-communist. I'll give you an example. In 1956, Eisenhower had been president for 3 or 4 years. The Hungarian Revolution occurred.
Right.
Ordinary people in Budapest and throughout Hungary rose up, chased the communist forces out of their country, and proclaimed freedom again for Hungary. It was obvious that the communist forces, mostly Soviet trained and so forth, mostly Russian, were going to come back. They weren't going to allow this to continue. Yeah. And so they needed help, the people in Budapest and throughout Hungary. They sent out a message to the free world and said, please help us. Well,
amazing.
General Franco in Spain, who was the head of Spain at the time, he wanted to send help. He had planes and he loaded them with the ammunition, rifles, whatever.
Amazing.
And he called Adenauer in Germany and he said, I can't fly to Hungary without refueling halfway. Can we refuel in Germany? And the permission was granted by Adenauer to help get those weapons to the people in Budapest. Well, at that point, Eisenhower got a hold of Adenauer and told him to cancel the permission, and the weapons never went.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was just one of the many, many things that Eisenhower did that the American people still don't know about. And
Wow.
he was pro-left, he was pro-communist. He took over the Republican Party and he got rid of the hardcore conservatives and put what we call today the Republicans in name only, RINO. They call them rhinos.
Sure.
And a lot of the Republicans are hardly any different at all from a left-wing communist.
Oh yeah, sure. They're very soft on it, and he probably wanted to, in his idea, well, maintain the gentleman's agreement at Yalta, or between that certain parts of Europe will be communist or under Russian influence, and the other parts will be under the Western Allies. But the Hungarians they were never consulted.
That's right.
They wanted nothing to do with that.
That's right. That's
amazing, huh?
You mentioned the meeting at Yalta where Roosevelt got together with Churchill and Stalin, and Roosevelt's top advisor at Yalta was Alger Hiss.
Yeah.
Later shown to be a communist.
And what was Alger Hiss telling FDR?
Well, he was telling FDR, here's the best way to make sure that the communists stay in power in Soviet Union and that we don't impede their progress toward taking control of more parts of the world. They had taken control of Eastern and Central Europe. They were very responsible for China going communist with diplomatic help and so forth. And
wow,
and now
unbelievable. Just let me ask you a question, a rhetorical question. How many U.S. soldiers and Marines and armed forces died thanks to traitorous State Department employees?
Well, and you got the big numbers in the Korean War, 1950 to 53, and what you'll find there, if you look into it, is that the American troops had won the war. In fact, brilliance of General Douglas MacArthur with a amphibious landing behind the lines of the North Korean army, completely defeated them. Went all the way up to the Yalu River, and not only South Korea, but North Korea, all of the whole peninsula was now again in freedom. When the Chinese communists came across the border in great numbers, much more number numerically than our own forces, and we slugged it out with them for a couple of years. MacArthur was fired. The Chinese general who led the troops eventually said in China, and was proud to be able to say it, I would never have sacrificed my troops going into Korea if I had not been assured that the American forces would be restrained by their own government.
Amazing.
MacArthur wrote that in his own book, Reminiscences. So you see all kinds of treachery along the way, and Eisenhower involved in much of it.
And Truman? Was Truman he was in over his head, or was he part of the cabal?
He was partially in over his head, but he relied on another terrible example of an American named Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson was never found out to be a communist, but in my view, he was cheating them out of dues.
Funny. Wow. And then of course,
the legacy of Dean Acheson lives on today. Dean Acheson was the architect of NATO. NATO was formed in 1949. And it was because we formed NATO in 1949 that Truman sent troops to Korea without a declaration of war. He was asked by some decent journalists, how can you do this? The Constitution says the U.S. doesn't go to war unless there's a declaration of war by Congress. There was no declaration. And Truman said, if I can send troops to Germany in NATO, I can send troops to Korea. And he did. And he did.
That became the basis for not only NATO, but also CENTO.
There was also a CENTO. That one was abolished. CENTO was the excuse for us to go into Vietnam. Now, if you look into the United Nations Charter, you see that permission is given in the United Nations Charter for a group of nations to form an alliance like NATO, like SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization.
Yeah.
But one of the conditions is that whatever steps are taken militarily have to be announced to the United Nations before the steps are taken. And some of the generals that fought in the Korean War came back and testified before Congress that the enemy knew what we were going to do before we did it. How did they do?
Oh, so they were apprised. Excuse me, John. Basically, anytime any action was taken in Korea, the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War, they were advising the UN step by step.
Yes, exactly. That was a requirement of NATO and SEATO that you had to do that. And so they did it. And the head of the military affairs at the United Nations all during that period, there was 9 of them in a row who were all from the Soviet Union or from one of the satellite nations. And they'd get the information. Here's what the Americans are going to plan to do. Okay, notify the Chinese Communist forces, notify the North Korean forces, tell them what's going to happen and be ready for it. That's exactly what was going on. And that can be shown from the Charter of the United Nations.
All right, let me zero in on something, and that is how when Kennedy was shot, the narrative became not that, and I don't know if you think Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy or not, but the narrative became, no, it wasn't a committed communist or Marxist that did it. No, they were right wingers. These are people in the CIA or the FBI that were deeply opposed to John F. Kennedy, and they had him killed. And the right wingers, they'll throw John Birch Society under the bus. What do you think about the JFK assassination? What happened? What are your views on it? Whether it was a conspiracy or whether it was the action of a lone gunman?
Well, the attitude of the American people was shaped by the Warren Commission and others who claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the killer, and he did it from the 6th floor of the Book Depository building there in Dealey Plaza in Dallas. Now,
right.
I got very friendly with a doctor who was a member of the Birch Society, and he was a member of the society when that happened. He was stationed at Parkland Hospital where the body of John Kennedy was taken, the already dead body. And he would go around and he would talk to Rotary clubs and Kiwanis, whatever, wherever he could get an audience. And he said, if you believe Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy, you didn't see what I saw of the body of John Kennedy. All right,
let me ask you a question. What's that doctor's name?
Doctor's name was Dave Stewart.
So was he in the emergency room, or was he
in
just
the emergency room at the time? He saw the body when it was brought in. He said Kennedy was killed by a bullet that entered the front of his head, blew out the back. And that's why Jackie Kennedy was up on the back of the limousine fetching the piece of head that had been blown out of John Kennedy's skull.
Right.
So Dave Stewart, I said, Dave, you're absolutely certain about it? He says, yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. Dave Stewart has passed on now, but I got friendly with him, and I met with him on several occasions. He was a wonderful guy, good doctor. He had moved to Tennessee, and that's where he was living. Here's a copy of the Lebanon, Tennessee newspaper, and I don't know whether you can read that or not.
Oh, sure.
He says, JFK shot from front, speaker tells the Rotary. All right?
Uh-huh.
Here's a picture of Dave Stewart and the head of the guy who was the head of the Rotary Club at the time.
Right.
So, all right, Lee Harvey Oswald eventually said that he was only a patsy, and 2 days later, he was killed.
Right.
And the story went on and on that Lee Harvey Oswald, there's no way that he could have killed Kennedy from the 6th floor of that window in the.
Yeah, but wait. John, let me give you a little pushback here. I'm not a Marine. They practiced, and at that time they did also, firing at that time an M1 rifle from as far as 500 yards away to the target. That was only like 83 yards. Why was that such a tough shot? The car wasn't going very quickly. It wasn't swerving. Why was that such a difficult shot to pull off?
Well, people who are gun enthusiasts, many of them have told me it's an impossible. It couldn't have been done. He had to station himself. He had to twist his body. He had to fire to the right with his gun in his right hand, and it just didn't add up. And the fact that he said he was a patsy and that he was murdered almost immediately after he had said that certainly lends great credence to the theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed a patsy.
Well, I mean, you don't think he was a fake defector, do you? You think he really was working for the CIA?
I think he was a very confused young man. He had been stationed in Moscow. He joined the communists when he was in Russia. He was kind of a poorly trained American, I guess you could say. He didn't know the difference between communism and Americanism. He was a perfect patsy to have been.
Well, I mean, people will push back on that and say, "Well, listen, he told so many demonstrable lies." And that's what Vincent Bugliosi says, going back to the time when he met his wife, stating falsely about his age and a number of other factors.
That's right. He was not a very admirable individual in many respects. I agree.
Yeah, but what about let me ask you a question. Did the John Birch Society people ever have any opinion about whether or not he did take a shot at General Walker?
Yes. Yes. It was Lee Harvey Oswald who did take a shot at General Walker.
And how is it that why is it that they believe that he did take a shot at the general?
Well, you're taxing my memory a little bit here, and that happened before I was in the Birch Society. But what I know of it is that investigations were conducted, and it was determined that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who did that.
Sure.
And tried to kill General Walker. So
sure. Okay, great. So then we go into the aftermath of America and the United Nations. America basically needing to inform the United Nations about, if not war, in quote, police actions that involve thousands and thousands of U.S. troops and Marines and military assets, and lots of people getting killed, lots of our warriors getting killed. So basically, you would say that our actions in Vietnam, were they also similar to Korea in that we were advising the United Nations constantly on our plans and our activities and deployments? Well, was that also happening?
Not only that, but the rules of engagement were published finally by Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, 25 years later.
Wow.
I got a copy. He put them in the congressional record, by the way. So I went.
Oh, he did? Wow.
I dug it out in a library and I photocopied. I have copies of it still in my files. The rules of engagement. And this was mostly what I saw was directed at the Air Force, the people who were flying the planes, Marine pilots, Navy pilots, whatever. I have a good friend who did 99 missions over Vietnam. And I said, were you told that you couldn't shoot a target here or there? He said, absolutely. He said, I was told that I could go after a truck if it was on a road, but if it pulled off a road 100 yards, I couldn't touch it. I could not bomb the ships that were coming in and out of Haiphong Harbor, delivering all the weapons of war for the North Vietnamese, and so on and so on. So again, we saw that the United States military was sent into a position where they were told to fight but not to win. And finally, they pulled out completely. And the Vietnam War became the first war that the United States was defeated.
Yeah, and well, about that, they fought very hard. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong fought very hard. But I mean, when we pulled out after the treaty, the Paris Treaty, things were, I would say, pretty stable. But what happened was we pulled out, and Nixon, resigned in disgrace. And after that, resupplying the South Vietnamese like they should have been able to expect from us, their staunch ally in Vietnam, didn't happen.
Let me stop you and tell you, the United States supplied both sides in the war in Vietnam. Tremendous quantities of military gear and so forth going to Eastern European countries, being immediately loaded on ships and headed to Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam.
Amazing.
We had a campaign within the Birch Society to petition the United States Congress to put a stop to that. We had several million signatures on petitions, and it still didn't work. They continued doing it, and then they finally decided, okay, it's time for us to leave Vietnam. So they did, and a lot of the people there.
It was.
Go ahead.
It was a de facto defeat, but it wasn't. What I want to say, John, was that it wasn't as if we suffered a defeat like the French did at Bien Bien Phu.
That's right.
But for all practical purposes, they won. They got their way. They took over the whole country. But it was one of those types of defeats that was we put in a proxy. We basically, the people that should have been in the thick of it, and they were the South Vietnamese, and we walked away from it. But we let them down. They got, I'm sure all the military material they needed to conduct the war, and we pulled back and pulled out. And it was, but it was one of those types of things that it wasn't as if they beat us on the battlefield. Although we had some really horrendous fighting. We got bloodied so many times.
There was some real fighting going on there. But again, the United States forces were constrained by our own government's rules of engagement. It was a betrayal, tremendous.
It's astonishing
of our military. There are guys who are finding that out still, who served in Vietnam, and they're very angry about it. But at least they came back home. A lot of them came back home in coffins.
Yeah, and a lot of them had destroyed lives.
Yes.
So you look at all the situation. It's not just accidental, the things that happen in our country. And I remember, the fellows in the TFP, whom I got to know in South America pretty well. They said to me, look, what we believe is that the state of the world is not just accidental. It's planned and intended and methodically carried out as part of a conspiracy.
Exactly.
Now they've converted the word conspiracy into something that sets off alarm bells in anybody's head. You say conspiracy, and people are taught, like Pavlovian dogs, to react false, alarmist, paranoid, and
conspiracy theorist.
Exactly, right.
That's the new pejorative.
By the way, what we call. It's funny. I belong to several Facebook groups, and the people who believe that Lee Harvey did it are called lone nutters. That's a derogatory term. I say, no, we should be called lone gunners. And then they have the CTs, these conspiracy theorists, or they would prefer critical thinkers. And I do think that the Cubans, when Lee Harvey Oswald went to the Cuban consulate, I do think they stirred the pot and they tried to get him. They knew what they were dealing with. They were very well trained in intelligence. I think they were very brilliant people. The Cuban intelligence apparatus was, I think it at some point it was like without peer in the world. It was, it was the envy of a lot of countries. But I think they were very adept at winding him up. They didn't let him have a visa. Here's a former Marine who goes in there and he shows that he's gung ho regarding communism, and they didn't give him a visa, and he was angry, distraught, befuddled, and he supposedly left saying, "I'm going to kill JFK because of this." And at the time, Castro gave a speech shortly beforehand saying that those leaders who try to plot my downfall or my death themselves can't be free from fear, that the same fate would befall them. Now, I'm paraphrasing, of course. But anyway, we get back to America in the 1970s. We have the situation where our armed forces are hamstrung in being able to prosecute the war adequately. Colonel David Hackworth famously, attacked the way we were conducting the war, and he himself proved that he could take a ragtag bunch of people that he did with the 439th, and he turned them around into real warriors who gave tremendous losses to the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. And but so then there we have it. We have a nation demoralized, saddled with a de facto defeat in Vietnam. It was ignominious. Later on, we find out that many North Vietnamese, because of the accuracy of our bombing that had developed substantially by 1971 or 72, they were realizing that they could actually become war criminals, and they were begging the U.S. POWs. I don't know if you ever heard that. They say, remember me, I'm Mr. Nice Guy, and they were improving the treatment of U.S. POWs because they thought that America was getting so accurate and lethal with its bombing that there was the North Vietnamese government was possibly teetering. But anyway, that's what we found out later. But what we do know is that they won their objective. We did not. We lost upwards of 60,000 men and some women, I guess. So now we have America at the end of the Vietnam War. It's late 70s. Jimmy Carter gets in. Tell us about the JBS, Ronald Reagan, the 1980s, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. What are your recollections?
Well, you mentioned Carter. He was a puppy dog for the Rockefellers. He was one of the first members of the Trilateral Commission, which was a international grouping of nations that was all bad in our view. I wrote about it. You mentioned Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the rhetoric was good. The performance was almost completely opposite. He turned his government over to the internationalists within the State Department and other places in the government of the United States, and the progress that could have been made wasn't made for America. And after him, and we got into the Bushes. George H.W. Bush.
Well, but let's say, go ahead.
George H.W. Bush is the one that got us into Iraq, the first Iraq War, and then the son got into the second Iraq War, and we didn't win those either. You send the troops to win. Victory should be the goal, or you shouldn't bother. And that's why MacArthur was fired, by the way.
Sure.
He wanted victory.
Right. And so, although he did, they say that he tried to show up Truman and didn't respect his authority. Do you think that's true?
No. What happened is Truman's excuse, by the way. The Speaker of the House at the time was a Republican congressman from Massachusetts named Joe Martin. And Joe Martin, as the head of the Republican Party, had written to MacArthur and asked him to explain some aspects of the war in Korea. And MacArthur, what options did MacArthur have? He answered the letter, and he gave some opinions, and that infuriated Truman, and Truman used that as an excuse to fire General MacArthur.
Right. The story about Harry Truman ordering General MacArthur's plane to land first. You think that's true, or was?
I don't know the story.
Well, the story is supposedly is that there was a meeting, possibly in Guam. Harry Truman was in the air, in Air Force One, and we also had General MacArthur flying as well. And apparently, the story is that General MacArthur ordered the plane to wait until President Truman landed first, so that basically the person of honor that everyone was waiting for would be General MacArthur. And so finally, supposedly Harry Truman got on the radio, and he ordered the pilots of General MacArthur's plane to land, or they'd be court-martialed, or words to the effect.
Never heard
so
that.
they landed. And
I never heard that story.
Is that true? Do you know that about that story?
I never heard that story.
Really? I can't believe that I could tell John McManus anything he didn't know. Maybe something like maybe there's some things about food and Kimball that you didn't know, and I could tell you. I don't know. Anyway,
swordfish on Friday.
Oh yeah, Blackstone bass they used to call it, right?
Something like that.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say is that but with Reagan, I mean, gosh, he went on this, embarked on this very, very aggressive. I mean, that's what we've always been taught, or what I've always read: arms buildup, ship buildup. He went with the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative to try to develop a way that would be like a missile shield that totally upset the Soviets. They never knew exactly how many missiles could get through. They like to have easy calculations on things, or sure calculations on things. And he basically injected a wild card into the whole picture. And
that's the general attitude about him. I like to look at Reagan and say, what did you do when the Soviets shot down the Korean airliner with Congressman Larry McDonald aboard? And he did nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
Right. And do you think the Soviets took that plane down because of the congressman?
I don't think nothing else makes any sense. I think what happened is that the pilot, who was the favorite pilot of the president of South Korea, who was an anti-communist, that the pilot of the plane that McDonald was on was had a gun at his head and was told to fly into Soviet airspace, where the Soviet fighter plane came up and hit the plane. But the plane did not crash into the sea. The plane landed in Sakhalin Island.
It landed?
Oh yeah, that was proved to my satisfaction by some of the investigators that we had within the John Birch Society, some former pilots and writers and so forth.
So basically, that plane was taken down, but did it land?
Well,
crash land or what?
It was a 747 plane, and it has 4 engines hanging from the wings.
Yeah.
The Soviet fighter sent a heat-seeking missile that hit one of the outer engines, and disabled the plane. But the plane was in the air for another 10 minutes, searching for a place to land. And they finally ended up landing on Sakhalin Island. And
the hands of the Soviets.
And from that point on, we never heard a thing about them.
So then, right. So based on what your sources say in the John Birch Society, so the plane landed under its own power. Did it crash land?
No crash land. It was wounded. There's no doubt about that.
Sure, it was badly disabled probably, but they were able to fly it. So So then what happened? To the Soviets then massacre all the passengers?
Well, you can guess any kind of thing that happened to them, but not one of them has ever come out and say I was one of the plane's passengers. Not one.
Did they ever? Of course, but did they ever find any wreckage to that?
Well, it was Sakhalin Island. There was no way you could get into Sakhalin
No,
Island.
right, I know that, but I mean,
Without
sure, but that outcome is something that we've never heard. I've never heard before. It's amazing. And so, but my question is, so then, thus, when they conducted the rescue mission, or I should say, the retrieval mission to try to retrieve bodies, they never found anything. They never found any debris, right?
That's correct. Well, I think there was some debris. There might have been, if the engine was hit by the heat-seeking missile, part of it probably ruptured the skin of the plane, and there may be some pieces of plane that were found, and so on.
Wow.
But the plane itself, as far as we know, it landed, and there's never been any information from our government or the Soviet government and anything about where the plane was, because they want people to believe that it's at the bottom of the sea somewhere and it can't be found, which is a lot of hope.
Wow. So let me ask you a question then. Moving on. They say that politics is downstream from culture. And so then that, of course, begs the question, what did the JBS see about what happened in American culture in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? What was going on? And how does this play into the hands of the globalists, the internationalists that wanted the United States to be kind of basically vetting anything that did with the UN, basically giving them control, veto power over our foreign policy? And what was going on? This, of course, brings up topics related to the church, the deep church.
If you're talking about the culture of our country, religion has been
Hollywood.
Well, Hollywood is very guilty of destroying the moral perspective of an awful lot of people. There are still people who suffer from that today. I mentioned the book that I wrote just recently. It's only out a few months. The Deep Church.
State the name again, please, John.
The name
of the book again, please.
The Deep Church Revealed.
Okay, sure.
And it starts off talking about the decline of membership in the Catholic Church that took a real hit beginning in, what have I got here? 1965. Well,
yes,
you're probably old enough to remember the old Latin Mass, and now,
of course,
it's all different.
But actually,
I still go to the old Latin Mass.
Right. Now, I remember the first Mass I served at. I was 11 years old, and the priest had a dispensation, apparently, to say the Mass in Latin. Although it was like it looked like it was the new Mass, but he was saying prayers in Latin. And this was a time when the altar servers still had words that they would say in response to the priest. I will go to the altar of God, the God who gives joy to my youth. And so we were saying that stuff, and this is 1969. But things changed. So tell us about what happened in the church in the 60s and how it all dovetailed. Because let me something else I'll mention, John. Because I was a kid at the time. Sometimes when you're a kid, you see things that sometimes the adults don't see, or maybe they don't remember because they were busy with other things, or they just had scant attention. But I remember when I was a kid going to church on Saturdays for confession. And this is 1969 or so, 68 maybe, that there were posters that the pastor would put up in the bulletin board about movies you should not see. They'd have a description, I guess, the Legion of Decency maybe put these printed these things, but they were basically kind of like a moral rundown on the popular movies of the day, and which ones should not be seen, which ones were okay, and that ended, and then that was done, You know, it's
That's
like
right. And Hollywood had to pay attention to that. They wanted, they went to the Legion for Decency and they asked for the approval of it. They give us an A rating or whatever the ratings were. I remember that just as well as you do. It was very effective and it got done away with.
Yeah, so let me transition to something else. I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned that you knew Malachi Martin. Now we've talked about a lot of different things in this conversation. Hope you don't mind, but sometimes that's how it is. You get interesting conversations, and people say, "Gee, this would have made a great interview. Too bad we didn't record it." But here we are recording it. But about Malachi Martin, tell me your memories of Malachi Martin. Tell us about your relationship, your friendship with Malachi Martin, the things he said and did. I don't know if I guess you had a number of encounters with him, right?
Yes. I don't know, was it 3 or 4 times that I visited with him at his apartment in Lower Manhattan, and spent a couple of hours each time with him talking about this.
Whereabouts did he live, John?
He lived right off Park Avenue. He had a very sumptuous place. He'd made a lot of money with the books he wrote.
Oh my gosh! Well, I used to work the neighborhood of Park Avenue and 40th Street, around there, and I worked on 40th Street. And
he was on a side street off Park Avenue, probably in the low 50s, and he had the entire floor of a building. And you couldn't get up to there without going in the elevator and so forth. So I'd always have to tell him who I was and so forth. And he would always say, "Oh, send him right up, send him right up."
Oh, wow. How about that? Wow. I used to go to church at Our Savior, beautiful church that Father George Rutler was, I think, pastor at.
Were you living in Manhattan?
Yes, sir. Oh. I was living in Manhattan for a while. Then, of course, I was living in the Bronx. I had lived on the Upper West Side. I lived in the Lower East Side. I lived in Queens, and gosh, about 3 locations. Man, I in a span of about 6 years, I lived in about 6 different places. Right. I got to see. I really got to see. I didn't go to Brooklyn to live there like you did, but
I was born and raised.
But I got around, and then I worked in Lower Manhattan. What's that?
I was born and raised in Brooklyn. My family moved out of there.
Yeah, I know. And in fact,
when I was at Holy Cross, and they ended up down in Virginia, but I still, I found growing up in Brooklyn was a very good thing to happen to me. It put a toughness in me, I guess, that might not have happened elsewhere.
I mean, it was a place where you had you had a certain opinion about things, and people didn't agree with you, and then a lot of times it would be, you'd have to duke it out, right? That was Brooklyn.